Hello everyone, welcome to Parasoft session. My name is Miroslaw Zielinski and I'm a product manager for Parasoft flagship product CERT Test. Today we're going to talk about accelerating coding standards compliance with dedicated reporting and workflow management. So, working at Parasoft, I've been constantly interacting with our customers for many years as a software developer. Last year I switched to product management, which gave me a unique opportunity to observe how our compliance solution is used from two very different perspectives. So today I would like to share with you some observations I've made regarding static analysis and also the workflows for coding standards compliance. So we will be talking about transforming the compliance process from looking like this into something like this. The presentation will use MISRA C 2012 and CERTC as examples, but our discussion will be pretty generic and it will apply to basically any coding standard. So before we start, let me do a quick poll. Please put your hand up if you're using any of MISRA coding standards for your development. Okay, thank you. And please put your hand up if you're using CERT coding standard for your development. Okay. And really the last one, please put your hand up if you're using any functional safety standards for your development. Okay, thank you. So before we start, let me tell you a few words about Parasoft. Parasoft has been around for more than 30 years. We are an independent company actively developing software testing technologies. We are leaders in compliance industry and our long presence on the market allows us to collect a lot of great experience and we try to share our experience back with the industry. Our experts are heavily involved with standards organizations such as CERT, UL 2900 or MITRE as a part of CWE. And we're present in two main sectors of the industry, embedded/safety critical and enterprise IT. For embedded and safety critical, we provide a complete software testing solution for C and C++, which helps our customers in producing high-quality source code, but also in achieving compliance with various standards, including functional safety standards. And our special focus is security, which is overarching our solutions for embedded and enterprise IT, as security is a common concern now. Here you can see some examples of the organizations that are using our compliance solution. The discussion today will be based on the experience we've collected over the years of collaborating with these customers. So before we start discussing workflow aspects of the coding standards compliance process, let's briefly talk about coding standards and the reasons to be compliant. Why do we need coding standards? Well, we use coding standards to make our source code better, which may mean portable, predictable, safe, secure, and we could name probably a few things more here, but safety and security are probably the two main benefits expected by the industry. Other thing is that static analysis and coding standards compliance is either explicitly or implicitly required by functional safety standards. And good example here is ISO 26262, which explicitly requires static analysis and coding standards compliance. 26262 mentions MISRA as sort of recommended coding standard, but there are many other coding standards out there. We have JSF, we have CERT, we have AutoSAR, and there are a few more. So with all these coding standards, the natural question rises, is there one coding standard we can pick to achieve safety and security? If so, which one? Or maybe we need to comply with more than one coding standard. So these are all very important questions, and there is a sentiment in the industry to associate certain coding standards with specific compliance goals, like MISRA and AutoSAR are for safety and CERT is for security. And we hear this opinion quite often when discussing with our customers, and we need to explain that it's not entirely true. Not everyone realizes that there is a significant overlap between these standards. And if we take a closer look, for example, at MISRA C 2012, we'll see that it covers security aspect quite well. Nonetheless, CERT is broader about security and treats this subject more thoroughly. So, does it mean we should strive for compliance with more than one coding standard? Well, in general, we do not recommend trying to be compliant with more than one coding standard. And mainly because of the fact I've already mentioned that there is a significant overlap between those standards. Our recommendation is to pick one primary standard for compliance and then consider extending it with some additional guidelines from other standards. So, for example, if security is our primary concern, then probably it makes sense to start with CERT coding standard and consider extending it. If we have also functional safety concerns, then probably MISRA will be more natural choice, and then we could extend MISRA with some additional guidelines from CERT coding standard. So, short example. End of last year, I spent some time in Japan talking to our automotive customers, and I had interesting observations. All of them decided to settle on this mixed approach. They selected MISRA C 2012 as their primary coding standard for compliance, and then they supplemented this with additional guidelines from CERT, and also some guidelines that were created internally inside the organization. So here you can see an exemplary rule set created by one of our customers. And as you can see, about 60% of this rule set were rules from guidelines from MISRA C, about 20% were guidelines from CERTC, and about another 20 were the guidelines from custom guidelines, guidelines created inside the organization. But today in this presentation, I don't want to spend too much time on discussing which coding standard to pick or how to customize it to adapt to specific needs of our organization. I would like to focus on how to accelerate the compliance process. And to answer this question, we need to get a better understanding first. What is the overhead compliance process imposes on our regular development? So how much extra time does it cost? What activities are required? What kind of documentation shall be prepared? And to answer these questions, we need to first get a better understanding what does it mean to be compliant with a coding standard. And the term compliance used to be loosely defined in the industry. In general, the understanding is free from violations of selected coding guidelines. And at the high level, it seems to be sufficient definition. In the end, it's not the rocket science. It's just about achieving compliance with coding standard. But unfortunately, vague or imprecise definition of the compliance is very often a reason for friction in business relations. So as soon as we want to close the contract, suddenly it appears that our contractor had a different understanding of compliance, and we have a problem. So this is one of the main recommendations we're giving to our customers. Have a clear definition of compliance. If you're developing software for external organization, then it's an absolute must. Definition of compliance should be a part of business negotiations, and we should have a clear understanding what is our definition of compliance before even starting any compliance-related activities. So what should be included in the definition of compliance? Well, we can turn to standards to seek for some guidance. And let's focus on MISRA first. For MISRA, there is a dedicated document titled MISRA Compliance 2016, which precisely discusses the subject of compliance process. And we do not have enough time today to discuss in details this document, but it was very well received in the industry, as it provides a guidance on the compliance process that was very often vague or imprecise. So at the root of this document lies the assumption that the software is developed in disciplined and documented process with compliance activities integrated into it from the very beginning. So not only we have an obligation to make sure our developers are creating compliant code, but we also need to be able to provide appropriate documentation. This documentation should include, of course, requirements for our system, architectural design, but also a set of very specific documents that needs to be created to document compliance with MISRA coding standard. And MISRA speaks about 4 documents. First is called Guideline Enforcement Plan. This is the document which is basically a declaration. How are we going to enforce the compliance with every single guideline? Then we have Guidelines Recategorization Plan, which is a document showing any changes in default categories of MISRA rules. Third thing is documented approach to deviations process. So we should be able to generate a deviations report from our system, which is showing all the exceptions from the standard. And the last thing is Guidelines Compliance Summary, which is a final outcome of our compliance process, which is stating our level of compliance with every single guideline. So these are the requirements for compliance process with MISRA standard. Now let's see an example of the workflow based on Parasoft automated framework, and let's see how it helps in accelerating the compliance process with MISRA coding standard. The workflow I'll be presenting here assumes that there is pre-commit and post-commit scan. The process starts with the team leader or functional safety officer or any similar role defining a test configuration with the collection of static analysis checkers to enforce compliance with MISRA standard. This configuration can be customized. MISRA compliance process allows for customization, and developers can users can are permitted, for example, to disapply advisory guidelines or change default categories of the rules. Once the configuration is defined, it is automatically made available for all the team members, and developers can access it directly within their IDEs for immediate scan of code just after code is created. And this is the critical element of the workflow. If we want to accelerate the compliance process, we need to make sure that our developers can scan the code just after it is created. From our experience, even 20-30 minutes delay in delivering the results of compliance scan can become the problem. With this delay, developers are already focused on something else, and switching the context make negative impact on their productivity. So checking for code compliance should be basically the same as checking if the code compiles. In the next step, developers check in the code, which triggers the build at the CI server where additional compliance scan is made. And a small digression here. We frequently get questions about, from our customers about possibility of setting up static analysis and compliance scans as check-in gates. here. So simply the intention is if the code is not compliant, then the check-in is rejected. And it is meant to be a replacement for any other compliance scans in the workflow. And while we have several customers using the workflow like this, in general, we strongly discourage everyone from setting up the workflow this way. With check-in gates, developers get easily frustrated with rejected commits, and the team workflow is hindered because dependent components of the code are not integrated on time, and developers start to see static analysis as an obstacle and not as help. So our recommended workflow assumes that there is no check-in gate, but we have this additional scan at the CI level. And you may ask the question, why do we need this additional scan at the CI level if developers are supposed to generate clean code? And the answer is that developers generating clean code is the ideal situation, which almost never happens. Because with MISRA, for example, you have some guidelines that are enforceable only at the system level, where an entire code base is scanned. So developers working on a subset of files in their IDEs may not be able to catch all the guidelines. Other reason is that developers may just overlook a violation or decide to check in the code even with the violation. So whatever the reason is, with the central compliance scan at the CI level, we get a single source of truth about our level of compliance. It will be hard to compete.
The keynote Developing Game-Changing Embedded Intelligence with Jim Tung from MathWorks will start at 1:30 p.m. in the Nuremberg Convention Center Ost, Room Sydney. The access is free of charge for all visitors and Congress participants.
And the results from the CI scan are sent to Parasoft Central Reporting System, which provides dashboards, widgets, trending data, and Violations Explorer, which team leader or functional safety officer can use to triage the violations and assign them back to developers for additional corrections. And developers can fix the code, scan it locally, and check in, initiating another circle. And once we reached our desired level of compliance, the central reporting system will automatically generate compliance reports for us, including all the documentation that is required by MISRA compliance process. And this is a huge time saver because it allows us to reduce the amount of tedious manual work that would be otherwise required. So that's the workflow for MISRA. Now, let's take a quick look at what does CERT standard tells us about compliance, or shall we rather say conformance, because in CERT documentation you have conformance word being used instead of compliance. Since CERT standard does not require a lot of documentation to prove compliance, what standard says is that the source code shall be free from violations of the rules from the standard. And there are two important things here. CERT standard distinguishes rules and recommendations, where rules represent obligatory guidelines and recommendations are not obligatory. And second thing is that all the guidelines in CERT standard are classified into 3 levels, level 1 to level 3, where level 1 represents the most critical guidelines. So in case of CERT, we can be conformant with the standard at different levels. And this classification of the guidelines is unique to CERT standard and very valuable to the users because it's based on a risk assessment formula that is introduced by CERT standard. And this risk assessment formula scores each guideline in a standard against these 3 factors: severity, likelihood, and remediation cost. And the final priority of the guideline, which translates to the level of the guideline, is computed as a product of these 3 values. And this is enormously valuable extension of the standard because it allows us to focus on most relevant problems first. And the most relevant problems are the ones that are classified as severe, likely to occur, and inexpensive to fix. So with this approach, we get the highest return on our investment into compliance process. And last small remark about CERT requirements for conformance. Similarly as in case with MISRA, CERT requires disciplined and documented approach to handling deviations. So we should be able to generate a documentation for every single exception from the standard, and every single exception from the standard should preferably fall into one of predefined categories. So these are the requirements for conformance with CERT. Now, let's take a look how does the workflow for conformance with CERT looks like. Well, it looks pretty much the same as in case of MISRA, because this is probably the most effective and efficient workflow for compliance with any coding standard. So, as you remember, we have a central configuration prepared by the team leader or functional safety officer. We have developers working locally on the source code and scanning the code locally. And we have a central scan at the CI server for process management. And the unique element of this workflow is the reporting system, which implements the CERT risk assessment framework. So this is where we can get this precious information about the priorities of the violations. So with this reporting system, we know where to start our work, and we know where to focus. And closing our discussion slowly. I've mentioned at the beginning that it doesn't make sense to strive for compliance with more than one coding standard, like, for example, MISRA and CERT. But this reporting with risk assessment framework is a differentiator, and this is something that provides a real value. So in some cases, even if in general we strive for compliance with MISRA, it may make sense to scan the code with the solution that fully supports CERT guidelines and this reporting framework with risk assessment, just to see how we score against risk levels from CERT, what's our cumulative remediation cost, and what's our likelihood score, for example. And with this being said, we've reached to the end of the presentation, so time to conclude it. The title of the presentation was Accelerating Coding Standards Compliance with Dedicated Reporting and Workflow Management. So we have briefly discussed what are the requirements for demonstrating coding standards compliance. We have discussed how does the workflow, which is proven to accelerate the compliance process, looks like, highlighting the critical elements of this workflow, like central management of the compliance configuration, value of compliance scan at the time of code creation, and value of compliance scans in the CI/CD pipeline. And we also discussed value of dedicated reporting, which automatically generate for us compliance documentation, and the value of risk assessment framework that allows us to focus on the most important problems first. So these two elements, compliance workflow and dedicated reporting, can help us in accelerating the compliance process. But of course, creating safe and secure software takes more than just achieving compliance with the coding standard. We will also need multiple other verification and validation techniques, such as system testing, integration testing, unit level testing, code coverage, penetration testing, runtime error detection, you name it. So if you are interested in learning more about these testing technologies and seeing how Parasoft supports organizations in improving quality of the source code and also achieving compliance with various standards, including functional safety standards, please come and visit us. We are here all 3 days. You can find us in Hall 4, booth 378. So with this being said, again, I would like to thank you for your attention. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them now. Thank you.